Let's talk about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now, one of the big questions in macro is why do we have these recessions? The economy's just going along fine and then suddenly, boom, recession. People lose their jobs. Folks hit long spells of unemployment where they can't find another job. People cut back their spending because times are tough. What happened? Did the economy suddenly get less productive? That's part of what distinguishes macro from micro. We understand there's always change in the economy. Sometimes one product sells really strongly, others flop. The economy is constantly shifting. Every month, something like 1 million people lose their jobs. But again, every month, something like 1 million people get new jobs. The economy is highly dynamic until suddenly that process slows down dramatically and we get an economy-wide drop. Ordinarily, there's a self-reinforcing process where people get new jobs and spend their wages to buy products so the economy continues to grow. This was pumped up into a thing called Say's Law, narrator voice, not actually a law, but it refers to the idea that supply ought to create its own demand. Every business decision about producing more output involves hiring more people or buying more inputs, which transfers funds to potential consumers. One example is Henry Ford, who was a really, really terrible person in so many ways. We're not going to get into that. He talked about paying the people assembling cars enough that they could buy a car, the very car he's making. In most cases, there are a few more steps, but it's still the case, and in some sense, recessions or depressions are a surprise. There was this virtuous circle where workers got more money and spent more money, so workers had jobs, until it hitches, and then a recession happens. Now, to be clear, Say's Law has more truth if we're thinking about the long run, as recessions and depressions are smoothed out. But in the short run, we want to understand, why does this happen? The short answer is money. Money is what breaks this down because there's this whole structure of a financial system. And so if people, for one reason or another, get worried and not want to spend the money that they're getting paid, then we get a recession. That would break Say's Law. On the flip side, this financial system also allows people to spend before they get paid. So there may be a symmetric case where we don't face a recession, but instead inflation. So we need to think about aggregate demand, which has money as a really important component, and the price of money, i.e. the interest rate, is a really important part of that. Now, before we talk about aggregate demand too much, let's talk about aggregate supply. Hint. You can get a sense of where this is all going if you're saying, this looks like a regular supply curve, except it's aggregate instead of just one market. And demand curve, yeah, that's similar. It's meant to be like a regular supply and demand curves, just like we've been doing previously. Economists like this metaphor, and we're going to use it, perhaps excessively. But since we studied demand and supply just recently, you should have some sense of how the new model will take shape. With any supply curve, we generally put quantity on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical. For aggregate supply, we use GDP, the quantity of output, on the horizontal axis. Then the vertical axis, instead of having one particular price, we put the price level overall. Aggregate supply links GDP with the price level. One complication is the price level is not inflation. Inflation is the change in the price level. Why is there a positive association between price level and GDP and aggregate supply? Well, for a lot of firms, their input prices are less flexible, so they're going to be willing to produce more if they can sell for a higher price. Maybe that's because they're a little bit fooled. They don't yet realize that their own costs will rise soon. Or maybe they're not fooled, but really savvy. They understand that their own costs won't rise and will stay under control. For one reason or another, there's going to be a positive association between GDP and price level for some part of the AS curve. The slope of the AS curve might change as the economy hits bottlenecks. Some input costs rise really high. Then the slope of the AS curve is going to get steeper. The economy gets closer to potential GDP, perhaps even beyond potential GDP. Firms would like to sell more, but they cannot get sufficient supplies to be able to sell more. They might bid up the prices they're willing to pay for inputs, and in turn raise the price they've been charging their customers. The aggregate supply curve gets steeper as the economy is near potential GDP. Now, I'm drawing potential GDP as a line, but that's really for convenience. It's more of a zone. But Trying to keep things simple here as we tell our story. On the flip side, there's aggregate demand. Wherever there's supply, there's got to be demand, right? We economists are just simple folk. We don't think that deeply about all these things. The aggregate demand curve links GDP on the horizontal axis with the price level on the vertical axis. Same stuff about price level overall, not just one thing. In this case, aggregate demand has a negative slope. Since the price level rises, people spend less. One of the big input prices to production are people's wages, and therefore as prices go up, but people's wages do not necessarily go up not nearly as fast, then people are going to buy a little less. So we draw this aggregate demand curve. Aggregate expenditure is what's driving aggregate demand, and recall from our definitions, aggregate expenditure is the sum of consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Abbreviated as C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C is consumption, I is investment, G government spending, X minus M is net exports. Aggregate expenditure, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. We're going to use that a whole bunch of times in the future, so start getting a hold of that. If any of these segments of aggregate expenditure increase or decrease, then aggregate demand would increase or decrease. We think the slope of aggregate demand curve is pretty steep because there's not actually very many changes going to occur very quickly or very much. There's a wealth effect where higher prices make the money that people saved up a little less valuable. There's probably going to be a link between interest rates and the price level, so there's going to be some impact of higher interest rates on things like investments. Exports might be lower if domestic prices are higher, but all those are going to be relatively small changes. Just as we're doing with supply and demand curves for individual markets, so too in aggregate. We distinguish between shifts along the curve and shifts of the curve, the whole curve. Shifting along the curve only taking account of price level changes. While if other stuff changes, then that's a shift of the curve. The point of monetary or fiscal policy is to shift the curve. Try to change aggregate demand to either fight against recessions if the economy is too slow or fight against inflation if the economy is too fast.